Um, Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this USSE virtual dialogue. My name is Per Wahlstedt. I'm an expert in healthcare at the Swedish Cancer Society, and I'm delighted to be a chair for this session. Today, we'll be talking about the important role of R&D for new therapies in addressing antimicrobial resistance for better cancer care. Antimicrobial resistance or drug resistance is a global health and development threat that needs urgent attention worldwide. The World Health Organization has stated that AMR is one of the top 10 global public health emergencies we're currently facing. Antimicrobials, like antibiotics and antifungals, are a key and indispensable part of cancer treatment. People with cancer are more susceptible to infections due to a lowering of their immune system, of the immune defenses. As many of 1 in 5 patients undergoing treatment is hospitalized due to an infection. And according to a new study, the incidence of drug-resistant infections was 1.5 to 2 times higher in cancer patients compared to non-cancer patients. There were 20 million new cancer cases reported in 2022, and these numbers are only set to increase. Scaling up cancer control efforts will be in vain if appropriate measures to address infections, especially drug-resistant infections, are not implemented. One of the major challenges is the development of appropriate new treatments and ensuring access to these treatments. This USSE virtual dialogue will focus on the important role of R&D for novel therapies to address infections and pathways to ensure access to these medicines. So in today's sessions, we hope to highlight the need to develop new approaches to financing, coordinating, and collaborating R&D for new therapies, and to ensure sustainable pathways for access. Our panel members will share critical work being done to address AMR in these areas, and we really hope to have a meaningful discussion on how we can address these problems drawing from our different experiences. Before I introduce our first speaker, I would like to encourage our listeners to post your questions in the Q&A box below anytime for the Q&A session, which take part at the end of the session. And I also would like to remind you all to please mute your microphones. Today's first speaker is Henry Skinner. Henry is the Chief Executive Officer of the AMR Action Fund, which is investing approximately $1 billion in companies developing antimicrobials for priority pathogens and advocate for market reforms to change how society values these life-saving drugs. Prior to joining the fund, Dr. Skinner held leadership positions across the pharmaceutical and venture capital sectors, including serving as Senior Vice President Venture at Tekla Capital Management and as the Deputy Head and Managing Director of the Novartis Venture Fund. And Henry will talk about the challenges in reinvigorating the R&D pipeline to address AMR. So Henry, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Per. Thank you for setting the stage and helping us understand just how important antibiotics are, particularly in cancer care. If I could have the next slide, please. So first, just to introduce the AMR Action Fund. We're a mission-driven impact fund dedicated to investing in new solutions, new antimicrobials to treat the most important drug-resistant pathogens that are affecting us around the world. And we look to guidance from the US CDC, the WHO, and other similar bodies to help us identify which pathogens are the most important and which indications are most critical for research and development of new antimicrobials. As mentioned, we have $1 billion under the fund. We invest in clinical stage companies proving the efficacy and safety of these new antimicrobials in these critical indications. We also advocate for policy change. So our goal is to help identify and support solutions that will make this a sustainable ecosystem to develop new antimicrobials, which we will always need as pathogens develop resistance to what we have, and to make sure that patients who have limitations in what they can take for a variety of reasons have options available that will effectively treat their infections. Next slide. So I think it's important to understand the setting here for antibiotics as it relates to pharmaceutical R&D. And the core of it is that it's expensive to develop any new drug. Antibiotics are no different, but the return on investment for antibiotics just is not there as it is in other indications. For example, direct-acting oncology drugs, respiratory, derm, cardiology, hematology, Alzheimer's, etc. And the consequence of this is that investors, including companies and those who invest in companies, will invest in programs that have the greatest potential return, not necessarily the greatest potential health impact. And so if it costs $500 million to $1 billion of a new antibiotic, but it only returns negative 100 million, we have a problem of investment in this space. And indeed, that's what we've found. As we've been investing, we have very few co-investors, simply because private investors do not see a return on their investment here. And therefore, we have a diminishing pipeline and a lack of investment that's creating significant issues. Next slide, please. So this is a snapshot of the clinical pipeline. You can see a trend in decline. The number of antibiotics in development is paltry. It's 77, and we know that most of these will not be approved. They will have issues of safety or lack of efficacy, or simply not be financeable. Only roughly a third of those target WHO priority pathogens, and 10% appear to be clinically innovative as determined by WHO. And so the consequence of this is we're not developing the antibiotics we need to maintain efficacy in the face of growing resistance around the world. And the promise of solutions coming over the next decade becomes vanishingly thin. Next slide, please. So this is an example of where the innovation takes place. So, we typically think of pharmaceutical companies as the large companies that are global, developing new products, and they do a phenomenal job of moving them through the clinic and bringing them to patients. But a lot of the innovation happens in small and medium companies. These companies might be 10 to 50 employees, sometimes less, typically with a year of cash or less, so very limited capital to invest in their programs. And this is where most of the innovation has taken place in new antimicrobials. And so these companies have limited access to capital and struggle to finance and support their innovation in a way that is effective and can advance them, and hence the thin pipeline. And so it's important as we think about solutions that we recognize where the innovation is, and we find tools to bring capital and investors back into this space to support the small innovative companies to take the risk in developing new antibiotics. Next slide. So to draw it to a conclusion, I think there are a number of things we have to do to revive the R&D pipeline and ensure there are effective antimicrobials to treat infections. First, we need to change the way we view and value antimicrobials. We can't value them as low-cost, rarely used pharmaceuticals that doesn't pay the cost of creating them. We need to see them as the total value, both from the standpoint of what they do to treat an infection and to save a life, but also what they do to prevent the spread of infection, to maintain the utility of all other healthcare interventions, from chemotherapy to other things, and see them as foundational, to the healthcare system, and really look to maintain them as a whole, to make sure that we have the tools we need to be effective in our healthcare. To do that, we need to fix the broken marketplace. So we can't have a marketplace for which a new antimicrobial earns 10 or 20 or $30 million a year, but costs $50 million a year to bring to the market and cost $1 billion to develop. That negative return on investment is an impediment and prohibits the new development of antimicrobials. We'd love to encourage the oncology community to use this voice to recognize that millions of cancer patients die from infection. And you can say they die from cancer, and they do, but if we could treat that infection, there's a hope with some of the new anti-cancer agents that we can provide many, many years of healthy, productive life as well. And lastly, we need to recognize that failure to maintain effective antibiotics as a whole is a moral imperative and critical for intergenerational justice. Our generations have benefited from the pioneering work in the 40s and 50s and 60s that gave us enormously useful antibiotics that we've used, perhaps misused a bit over the last 50 years. And we owe it to the next generation to give them at least as good of a capability to fight infections as we receive. And so I think there's a critical intergenerational justice issue, much as there is for anything else, sort of environmental, global warming, et cetera. And so I'll stop there and we'll continue on.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Henry, for highlighting the challenges in the R&D pipeline and also the need to encourage collaboration between the cancer and other infectious disease communities to ensure that we have therapies for the future. Our second speaker today is Leslie Ogilvie. Leslie is the director of the Secretariat at the Global AMR and R&D Hub. Prior to the hub, she worked as a senior researcher and lecturer in microbial ecogenetics at academic institutions in the United Kingdom and Germany, including the University of Brighton, University of East Anglia, and the Max Planck Institute for Molecular Genetics in Berlin, and in the cancer biotic sector leading R&D funding acquisition. And Leslie will talk about various incentives currently being employed to improve the R&D pipeline. Please go ahead, Leslie.
Thank you, Per, for that kind introduction and the opportunity to be part of this session to talk about the work that we do at the Hub or some of the activities that we're doing. So next slide, please. So I think Henry's already eloquently pointed out that we are, in a sense, losing the race against resistance when it comes to developing new antibiotics and antimicrobials in general. And these are the drugs that are sitting at the foundations of modern medicine. We know the current pipeline is woefully inadequate to address increasing resistance globally. But I think it's important to realize that we can't stop AMR, but we can slow its progression. We really need to mitigate the devastating impacts that it has globally and just be better prepared to prevent and respond. We know that research is part of the toolkit alongside other efforts to prevent and reduce infections and the spread of AMR in general. But we know that the resources that we have to do this are pretty finite, and in the face of many ongoing global challenges, efforts really do need to be better coordinated and aligned to ensure the most critical health needs are being addressed. Next slide, please. And this is kind of central to the work that we're doing at the Hub. We're a global partnership of 18 countries and 2 philanthropic foundations, so the Wellcome Trust and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And together with our observers and our stakeholders, we're working towards improving coordination of international efforts and initiatives in AMR R&D. One of our key outputs is the dynamic dashboard, which is a unique online repository of information on the global landscape of AMR R&D funding and incentives. So we hope that this is helping global stakeholders and countries to set priorities and actually maximize the impact of what we know are very limited resources. Next slide, please. So our dynamic dashboard, and this is just one of the reports that you'll see when you enter our dashboard, it allows us to explore who is funding what and where, and potentially identifying gaps and opportunities for AMR R&D. So we collate and present the investment, so-called push funding, from public and philanthropic sources. And this is important. We're not covering private sources of investment into AMR R&D currently at this time. And this is the funding sources since 2017. And from this data, we show that just over $3 billion have been invested into the discovery and development of new human antibacterials, again, since 2017. But I think what's worth pointing out, this is approximately 3 times more funding than AMR vaccines and diagnostics are receiving. Next slide, please. So our dashboard allows us to dig a bit deeper as well, and we see that nearly 70% of the total investment in human antibacterials, so over $2 billion is for the development of therapeutics targeting bacterial pathogens designated as priority, and this is by WHO, CDC, EDC, and others. And a large fraction is actually focus on projects addressing Mycobacterium tuberculosis, but also escape pathogens, many of which are known as resistant pathogens in cancer patients. Next slide, please. I thought it was also important today to actually talk about not only antibacterials, but also investments into antifungals. as we know that globally fungal infections can claim maybe up to 2 million lives annually, with resistant fungi posing really an escalating public health concern. And we know that patients receiving treatment for cancer are almost, they're usually more vulnerable to infections, including drug-resistant fungal infections. So our data show that's only a very small fraction of the investment into AMR R&D is for antifungal, so 4% of the investment portfolio that we show in the dashboard. Next slide, please. And so of this investment into human antifungals, the majority, so around 3/4, is targeting fungal pathogens designated as critical by the WHO's fungal priority pathogen list. So pathogens such as Cryptococcus neoformans, Aspergillus, Candida auris, and Candida albicans. But remember, this is still a very small fraction of the overall investment in human AMR therapeutics. Next slide, please. So who's funding this research into AMR therapeutics? So we know there's major contributions from countries and regions such as the US, the EU, the UK, and Germany, with major international and national programs and global partnerships established to encourage antimicrobial R&D. And I think we all know Carbex and GARP are great examples of this, with a focus on the most critical public health needs and helping to improve the preclinical and clinical pipeline. And as we've heard from Henry, our first speaker, the AMR Action Fund is significantly helping to stimulate the R&D of new antibiotics, antibacterials, and diagnostics. So, however, we know that on their own, these push incentives are still not enough to mitigate the multiple challenges associated with the development and post-market entry of these products. Next slide, please. I think we're all aware that policies that actually reward R&D, that enable the most needed new products to be brought to market and ensure that they are available to the most in need are required. And we see some movement in this direction. Countries around the world are continuing to engage and explore a range of so-called pool incentive options, so policies that actually reward successful innovation by providing a known return on investment and creating this viable market that Henry was mentioning earlier. I think the UK subscription model is perhaps the best well-known example of this. So we have fixed payments are made to companies for access to antibiotics rather than linking reimbursement to the volume sold. And this is important as it embeds the stewardship imperative in the transaction and eliminates the need to oversell these life-saving drugs. We know the UK is now expanding its efforts across the whole of the UK. We see that Sweden and Japan's models are focusing much more on access to antibiotics rather than stimulating innovation. Canada has earmarked funding for a pool incentive pilot, and Switzerland is laying the foundations for this as well. We know that European Union are discussing a multi-country access pilot, and the US PASTEUR Act, which includes a subscription type model for antibiotics, still continues to gain bipartisan support, but no concrete steps forward as yet. I've added Germany and France in here as well, these countries have actually been implementing pricing reforms for antibiotics to more appropriately reflect their value, but they don't de-link reimbursement from volume sold. And maybe it's really important to highlight that across all of these models, equitable access to products is not embedded in any of these models. Next slide, please. And just to flag that the Hub and WHO publish a progress report on these incentives models on a yearly basis. So this is available from our website. So I'm coming to the last slide. And I think all of us know here that 2024 represents a crucial year for AMR. So fora such as the G20, G7, UNGA's high-level meeting on AMR in September, and the 4th global high-level ministerial meeting on AMR in November are really pivotal chances to shape the AMR agenda, and in doing so, impact on global health, likely for the next decade or so. And that's why we've been advocating at the highest political levels, based on our data, based on our analysis, that we need to accelerate action and accountability. We need to have alignment and targeted action on financing mechanisms. And we've been encouraging the establishment of AMR R&D targets informed by public health needs. And of course, without equity in access to life-saving antimicrobials, as well as diagnostics and vaccines, we will never make meaningful progress. So I'll stop there, and thank you for listening.
So thank you so much, Leslie, for talking us through the various push and pulls incentives to accelerate R&D for new antimicrobial medicines, and also highlighting the need to ensure global access to these new medicines. Today's third speaker is Margot Warren. Margot is the Director of Government Engagement and Policy for the Access to Medicine Foundation. She liaises with governments, private foundations, and multilateral organizations that are actively working to improve global health and access to medicine. With over 10 years of experience in health policy, government relations, and strategic partnerships development, Margot has held various health research and policy positions before joining the Access to Medicine Foundation. Margot will talk to us about the AMR benchmark and what companies can do to ensure access pathways early on in the pipeline. So, welcome, Margot.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me here today to talk about this important issue. We recently published at the end of May a new report on R&D and looking at how the industry can get the few new promising drugs in development to patients battling superbugs, and that's available on our website. Next slide. Just a little bit about the Access to Medicine Foundation. Our mission is to mobilize essential healthcare companies to improve access to medicine, specifically in low and middle income countries, and to combat antimicrobial resistance. We are an independent nonprofit research organization. We don't accept any funding from the pharmaceutical industry or any affiliated philanthropic organizations. We're funded by governments and private foundations. Next slide. The report itself, which again you can find on our website, www.accesstomedicinefoundation.org, covers a variety of different areas in the R&D space, but is specifically looking at stewardship and access planning for those candidates that are currently in the pipeline and are looking very promising. So it features 5 case studies on these projects. It has 4 key findings that do sort of an assessment of the commonalities between those case studies and the interesting findings we uncovered. It features 2 large R&D-based companies, GSK and Pfizer, and 3 small and medium-sized enterprises that have promising candidates in the pipeline as well, and then looks at 113 low and middle-income countries. Next slide. So as we know, AMR is a global issue, but it's one that disproportionately impacts those living in low and middle-income countries. And when there is a significant issue with drug resistance in, say, Kenya, we know that that is ultimately a problem additionally for high-income countries like the US and the United Kingdom and the European Union. So we need to address the spread of antimicrobial resistance in low and middle-income countries if we also want to halt the spread on a global level. Unfortunately, what we also see is that a lack of access to the appropriate antibiotics and antifungals in low and middle-income countries is contributing to the spread of antimicrobial resistance, but also to significant deaths, disproportionately impacting, again, those living in the global south. And primarily, when you look at this map, you can see those living in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, are disproportionately impacted in terms of AMR attributable deaths per 100,000 in this data as of 2019. Next slide, please. One area that, of course, is important to mention in the context of this conversation is that there are many high-risk groups when it comes to antimicrobial resistance, even within that category of people living in low and middle-income countries, cancer patients being at particularly high risk. So bacterial infections are the second leading cause of death amongst cancer patients, and 1 in 5 patients undergoing cancer treatment will ultimately be hospitalized as a result of a drug-resistant infection. So the 2 disease areas are very much linked, and we need to think about making sure that access to antimicrobial products, antibiotics, and antifungals is ultimately something that is done strategically in combination with access to cancer care. Next slide, please. I think the other panelists have also touched on this, but we know the pipeline is extremely small. It's not historically been able to keep pace with the rising rates of drug resistance. Only 12 antibiotics have actually been approved for use between 2017 and 2021. This is very low in comparison to other disease areas. And currently, there are really a handful of new projects in late-stage clinical development that we look at in the context of this report. And we found that if these projects are approved, they could collectively save at least 160,000 lives each year. So it's really essential that new projects, if approved, actually do reach those that need them the most and on time. Next slide, please. So there are a variety of different ways that innovative new projects can be planned appropriately to reach those most in need. At the foundation, we refer to this as stewardship and access planning, and we look for whether companies have plans in phase 2 and onwards. That's when we feel there's a realistic time frame to start thinking about this early on. The reason we feel it's important to think about access and stewardship components while a project is still in the pipeline is that companies can plan ahead. They can think about where they're going to make a product available, how they're going to make it available and affordable, who they're potentially going to partner with, and to really think about both access and stewardship components. This is a chart that we feature in the report itself. It looks at the 5 projects in scope and ultimately what the companies are actually planning to do with those specific projects. I'll caveat that by saying Pfizer's project was actually approved during the period of analysis, and it is now on the market, but we still looked at sort of what they were thinking in terms of access and stewardship. One area that's really important, first and foremost, is the registration of new products once they're approved, say by the FDA or by the EMA. We feel that this is really essential to ensure availability, first and foremost, and to think very strategically about how is this new innovative product going to be addressing high burden of disease, and in which countries would be appropriate for first registration, thinking again about those that have the highest burden. We've also incorporated responsible intellectual property and licensing agreements. We've seen 2 of these companies partner actually with GARD-P on licensing agreements in low and middle income countries, which is a really efficient way of making sure that a product is available in low and middle income countries and at an expedited rate, especially when a smaller company like a small medium-sized enterprise or even a large R&D-based company that doesn't actually have a footprint in particular countries in the global south can consider how they're going to improve access through a license agreement that ultimately enables access without them necessarily having to market the product themselves in those particular jurisdictions. Some of the other areas that we look at as well, early access programs, manufacturing and supply considerations, equitable pricing. We also want to see if there is a clinical trial taking place in a particular low and middle income country, that the companies will commit to making that product available and registering it and making it affordable so that those populations can ultimately benefit from that product as well. We consider this to be post-trial access commitments and an incredibly important component of doing clinical trials. And then on the pediatric side, we feel it's also incredibly important to already be thinking about pediatric formulations. We know pediatric populations are also at high risk of developing drug-resistant infections, and companies should be thinking very early on about how they're going to start embarking on R&D for pediatric formulations. On the stewardship side of things, we feel it's incredibly useful to have companies come up with their own surveillance programs. Often it's the case where companies have very unique, interesting, rich data sets through their surveillance efforts, and being able to share that raw data in the public domain is incredibly important for helping to inform global disease patterns and helping other researchers capitalize on that interesting research and do further studies. So we like to see companies already thinking about surveillance programs and sharing that raw data, and then thinking as well about responsible promotion and sales strategies. Next slide, please. In the report, there are, as I mentioned, a few key findings that I'll go over today very quickly. Again, there's more detail in the report itself if you're interested in learning more. But we're seeing that while companies are employing a diverse range of strategies within their access and stewardship plans, we tend to find that affordability and stewardship in low and middle income countries are largely overlooked during the planning. So for example, there was only one company that had a very specific strategy in place in terms of pricing for its product in low and middle income countries, and the others did not have a significant strategy in place. We're also seeing that stewardship strategies to ensure appropriate usage, again, responsible promotion or ensuring companion diagnostics, were sort of lacking across the board in all of the case studies that we looked at. This can be really important to make sure that new efficacious products do not develop resistance themselves, and that we really protect the pipeline that is in development, and once new products reach the market, that those are not equally developing resistance as we have seen in the past. On the pricing side of things, we've heard many cases where people are not able to afford a full treatment scope and therefore are taking less of a particular antibiotic than is needed, which can ultimately also contribute to resistance. So it's important that people do have the appropriate prices linked to local ability to pay and socioeconomic factors so that they are able to afford the full treatment. Next slide, please. One thing we also noticed, as you may have seen in the chart that I showed, registration is a component that really needs to be improved across the board. We saw that oftentimes, unfortunately, when there were commitments for registration, they were only identified in sort of the same 5 countries, of course, upper middle income countries, China, India, Mexico, South Africa, and Thailand. And we saw no such commitments for any of the other 108 low and middle income countries in the scope of our work. So that means that while some companies are thinking about access kind of in relatively higher income markets, they're not thinking about it in the same way for the lowest income countries, which ultimately do correspond with the highest burden of disease for antimicrobial resistance. And the next slide, please. We were quite happy to see that there were significant efforts being made to produce pediatric trials and to think more proactively about pediatric drug development. That is a hopeful sign. As I mentioned, children are a high-risk group. So we did see 4 out of the 5 companies in scope actually initiating or conducting clinical trials involving children. Very much a positive step in the right direction to close that gap between adult and pediatric access issues. This is often something that we see in the context of our research at the Foundation, that there is a gap between when an adult product has been developed and when a pediatric formulation is available. So we'd like to keep that gap closing, and this was a positive sign from us. Next slide, please. The last key finding that I'll share, it may come as no surprise, but I think it is very important to mention that partnerships are really essential in helping to scale efforts. We heard at the beginning of the session from Henry, who was mentioning that a lot of the SMEs are really struggling. They're investing a lot of resources into maybe one product. They don't have the same capacity to market on a global scale. Partnerships can be a really important and useful tool for them to be able to increase access. Maybe they enter into a licensing agreement like we saw in the case of GARD-P, or partner with bigger companies who do have a larger footprint globally and can help kind of bring that new product to scale. But what we're unfortunately seeing is that there have been tools over the past few years created. One is the Stewardship and Access Planning Guidance document that was created by a collaboration between CARB-X, GARD-P, the Wellcome Trust, the Access to Medicine Foundation, and a variety of other government funders and partners. And this document was intended specifically to be for small and medium-sized enterprises to think about how they could embark on access and stewardship plans, what might be in the realm of possibility for them, areas that might be relatively easier to do, and offer more insight and information about how they can do that and the benefits of coming up with a stewardship and access plan, really. And so what we found in the report, unfortunately, was that a lot of these companies are not actually using the guide itself. They're not necessarily thinking as strategically as they could be in terms of the other resources that are out there for them and that may be beneficial. So we'd really like to see more uptake of these tools and really see more sort of innovative thinking around how can you realistically put together a strong stewardship and access plan, even if you're a smaller company, and certainly for the large R&D-based companies who do have more resources available for such planning. And I think that's the last slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you too, Margot, for highlighting the findings of the AMR benchmark and what companies are currently doing and areas that can improve upon to address AMR. Our final speaker is Greg Frank. Greg is Director of Global Public Policy with MSD, where he leads MSD's Global Antimicrobial Resistance and Pandemic Preparedness Policy. Previously, Dr. Frank served as a Senior Director, Infectious Disease Policy at the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, where he led several infectious disease policy issues, including AMR and vaccine regulatory and reimbursement policy. Prior to BIO, Dr. Frank led Science and Diagnostics Policy at the Infectious Diseases Society of America. And Greg will talk to us about strengthening collaboration towards finding novel solution and in its implementation. So, Greg, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Per, for the great introduction, and really appreciate Margot, Henry, and Leslie for really setting up the stage here. My directive, I think, was to try to pull some of these discussions together and really, I think, perhaps give a dose of optimism along with a healthy dose of recognition of the work that still needs to be done. But first, as Per said, I am with MSD, one of the remaining R&D pharmaceutical companies, still sort of engaged in antibiotic research and development, and stewardship and access, among other things. You know, we are have a history about 100 years in infectious disease, and we're one of the first companies to sort of manufacture penicillin back during the World War II campaign. So there's a lot of history here and commitment, and so we are fighting tooth and nail internally to keep that commitment going and remaining in antibiotic space in light of the challenges that everyone else has spoken to. But next slide. So, you know, what Henry and Leslie really spoke to is, and Margot, all of them spoke around, you know, the R&D challenges that we face here. And I certainly am not going to reiterate that. But I think it's good to recognize that, of course, we've seen a lot of great progress on those incentives that support R&D. As Leslie said, they are not enough. But if you go to the next slide, hopefully this all comes up together. You know, pull incentives, which remain really that primary mechanism when paired with push incentives to create that sustainable R&D that hopefully would unlock the investment we need to sort of hopefully reinvigorate the pipeline. I would argue for someone that has been doing AMR for a long time, there is a reason to be optimistic because we are seeing, I think, real signs of progress in advancing pull incentives and subscription models in many countries. And if you look to the right side of this, you know, we at our MSD would argue the G7 and the EU really have the wherewithal, the history of investing in public health globally to really take on the challenge of creating that ecosystem return. And what we do see is within the US, the UK, Canada, Japan, and all the EU at varying stages, pull incentives are underway. As Leslie mentioned, the Pasture Act in the US is a subscription model legislation. For those that are aware, the US has a challenging political environment, but there is opportunities for that bill to pass in the near future. In the United Kingdom, who are really leading the way, they are launching their full-scale subscription model program later this summer. And so they are going to be the first full subscription program underway, and they were the first to launch a pilot several years ago in that. Both Canada and Japan are respectively launching their own subscription-based pilots this year. There are varying differences between the two of them, but I think, again, it's a recognition that these countries are actually taking a tangible step to take action on this. And there's room to improve with both programs as we see more information, but half the battle is getting the momentum going. And I think I'm really happy to see that, hopefully by the end of the year, we will see tangible programs underway in both of these countries. And finally, in the EU, a massive piece of legislation, the EU pharmaceutical legislation, with many different components around innovation, was recently passed through the European Parliament shortly before its elections, which were just held earlier this month. But they did include a package of incentives to support AMR innovation, including, and one of them I do want to point out is there is a EU-wide subscription model for access that is discussed, and there's also a pull incentive that uses a transfer exclusivity extension voucher, which in the interest of time, I won't go into, but needless to say, it's another mechanism to create that return on investment. So all together, really, we are seeing signs of progress in these countries. And I think it's important to recognize that while also recognizing that there is still a lot of work to be done here. Launching a pilot does not mean the full program is launched. Passing legislation in the EU does not mean that we're done and we can wash our hands of it. This still requires a lot of engagement and recognition by all parties that see AMR as an important issue to tackle, to work together on. So if we go to the next slide, I wanted to take a bit of a look at access. And Margot really had a great overview of the challenges of access. And MSD, for example, ceftazidime tazobactam, one of our lead antibiotics, was approved by the FDA 10 years ago. As of today, we've registered in 80 countries, but it took us 10 years to do that. And there's so many more countries that we have not launched in due to the challenges of registration, the technical issues around countries and how they approach it. So I do think, like, even if you want to do the right thing, every company has a finite amount of resources dedicated to launching, and doing it in every single country piecemeal is unfortunately probably not a recipe for success to really get it where it needs to be. That's why I've been really heartened to see that after many years, I think, of sort of talking ourselves in circles about how do we make this work. We want to make sure there's structures in place to make sure antibiotics are used appropriately if you launch them. That I do think we're seeing actual real steps towards access in the global stage. And the first is, as Margot mentioned, there's an organization called GARD-P, the Global Antibiotic Research and Development Partnership, that was formed out of the WHO in the Neglected Disease Initiative several years back. And really, this organization's goal is to support development of antibiotics, but also their global access. And about 2 years ago, they entered into an agreement with the Japanese pharma company Shionogi for their antibiotic cefiderocol. And basically, Shionogi has licensed away the rights to that antibiotic in over 120 countries. And GARD-P is going to work with a generic partner, which is Orchid Pharma, based in India, to actually manufacture and launch that product. So the hope is that this is a new model that many companies may be able to explore, where, speaking for MSD, we're not likely to launch in many of these markets ourselves. So therefore, it could make sense for companies like ours to explore a similar type of agreement where we work with a partner or a generic manufacturer to make these antibiotics at a cost of goods that may allow access in low and middle income countries where there is no access. That isn't only sort of part of the problem. I think one of the issues I just said is the issue around registrations and the challenges. And the other is that it's very challenging to know what a demand or what is a need for antibiotics in many countries. It also might be quite low. And so I think there's a series of 3 initiatives that I feel are generally looking at different aspects of this, but I feel like they're converging on the same principle. The first is called the Secure Initiative, which is a program by GARD-P in the WHO. The second is an initiative by USAID, the U.S. International Aid Development Agency. And then the third is sort of a proposal by a think tank called the Center for Global Development. And all 3 of them are and I'm oversimplifying, basically look at a mechanism to pool demand. And the idea is a regional or global entity could actually seek to understand what is the need in, let's say, 30 countries within Sub-Saharan Africa or LATAM or East Asia, identify what that potential demand would, and then pool that demand through a mechanism to support the access to those antibiotics. I think the interesting wrinkle of this is there may be also ways to expedite registrations. Perhaps you don't need to register your product in every country. Maybe through this program, it could be an unregistered supply mechanism because it's going to be used so rarely. But the idea here is I think you can not only accelerate access, but also pool demand and actually create a sustainable market for both generic and on-patent antibiotic developers such as MSD. And on the right side of this graph, you can just sort of see a schematic from the SECURE initiative of how they think maybe this could work for an access antibiotic. And this is from the WHO's AWARE classification, where access is your first line antibiotics, watch is second line, and then reserve is sort of last line, break glass. There's different iterations of this pooled procurement mechanism that may make sense for each of these. You know, maybe the pool procurement for an access product is simply we just pool as much demand and aggregate that, and therefore a generic manufacturer sees that and says, okay, we can make this work. But for some of these other antibiotics, you may need a stockpiling mechanism because there may be uncertain or low demand. But the end stage here is we do see that all of these programs represent, I think, a bit of a paradigm shift where we are really trying to create an integrated approach to access. And I think it's important to recognize that there has been a lot of progress to date. None of these have launched. I will stress that. So again, this is a recognition that there's a lot more work to be done to really advance these, but I'm happy to see that at least we're seeing pretty grounded conversations that are figuring out how these would actually work. And I think that that is another case to be optimistic about, you know, AMR here. Next slide. And I think this leads to my next point. You know, we just discussed some of the innovation aspects, and then finally we're discussing access. And I think it's important to recognize that sort of unsustainable innovation and global access are almost two sides of the same coin, you could argue. There are problems that need to be solved together. And I think I wanted to flag that MSD sits on the Global Leaders Group for AMR, and this is a group formed by the WHO, WOA, the UN Environmental Program, and FAO, the quadripartite entities really from the multilateral organizations addressing AMR. And they released a report that really, I think, rings true to me, that it's the pipeline and access crisis. They're talking about these issues not in separate spheres, but in a single conversation, because I think there's a recognition that there are things that we need to be doing across the ecosystem, not only to support innovation, but access. They're not completely separate conversations. What we've seen here is push and pull incentives now are including provisions to better support global access for innovative antibiotics. We also should recognize that pull incentives can be tailored to ensure that the target products they're developing are not only meeting the needs for the high income countries that may be funding this, but also for the global needs. And I would argue that in many cases they may be the same, but there's ways for us to ensure that the pull incentives are not sort of diverging from the needs of the world as we implement these. And finally, I really do think that in something that's called out in the report is both the Group of 7 and Group of 20 countries have roles they can play, not only for innovation and access. And the report that I linked here, and hopefully when we share the slides, you can look at it, really highlight that there are some opportunities for collaboration there. And then last slide I have, I think I'm going over, is really, Leslie mentioned this as well. This fall, the United Nations is going to hold its second high-level meeting on AMR. And really, this is building on the 2016 meeting on AMR that I think really drove a lot of progress to date. This is where many countries implemented their national action plans in AMR. This is where that global leaders group that I mentioned was formed. This is where we're seeing many of those incentives and access mechanisms really born out of. And I think we really should look at this meeting as sort of an inflection point where we can accelerate our efforts and really build on the 2016 progress, which was great, but limited, and really create that tangible mechanism for sustained action, you know, over the next, you know, several years. And I think that's a really key thing is we do not want this to be another meeting where we have a lot of political attention and then 8 years go by and then we have another high level meeting where there's a lot of political attention. We really want to find a way to drive forward a sustained set of commitments by both the global north, global south. Every country has a role to play and things they could do to contribute, and we're hoping this high-level meeting can do so. Beyond the high-level meeting, I think it's good to recognize, I had mentioned the G7 and the G20. The G7 Leaders Summit was just earlier this month, and they had a commitment, speaking of innovation, on in accelerating push and pull incentives for R&D, as well as promoting access and stewardship. So again, it's good to see that the G7 and G20 are recognizing this, and I think it's important to recognize that both the G7 and the G20, as I understand it, are planning standalone side meetings this fall just on AMR. I think another reflection of, I think, the growing importance of AMR within those discussions, and also I think synergizing with the high-level meeting this fall. So I think there's reason to think that these discussions and the political momentum and attention, I think, can advance AMR on a broad set of fronts. And I think especially when it comes to access, where we need a lot of countries to work together, I'm hopeful that the UN high-level meeting can create that, I think, progress and momentum that we need. I've used momentum a lot today in this last slide, but I think it's really important to recognize that. So with that, I will pause, and I know we have a few minutes for question and answer.
So thank you, Greg, very much for talking us through what is currently in place to ensure access, and also the importance of the upcoming high-level meeting on AMR in September to put in place concrete steps to ensure access to treatments and their AMR. And also thank you for putting a bit of hope into this question. So now we can open the floor for questions. And I could start with a question actually, and it's to you, Henry, if it's okay. Recently you've written up about the issue of so-called brain drain in antimicrobial R&D, and what is the process like of keeping microbiologists in the field, or worst case scenario, getting them back in the field if they're left to pursue other research due to inadequate investment?
I think this is a really important point. As we know, developing new antimicrobials is quite an art. It's a different form of chemistry than we find in other pharmaceuticals. It requires very unique manufacturing to do safely and wisely. And the longer we have this challenge of financing innovation, and we keep people out of the field or don't support them, drive them out of the field if a company goes bankrupt and their future and their children's future is put in jeopardy, that builds a very negative connotation to people coming into the field. We've seen fewer microbiologists produced in the last years. We see clinical microbiology being diminished, and that can go on and on. We have to fix the marketplace. We have to recognize the value of antibiotics in order to keep people in and to train people. And I fear if another decade goes by, some of us will age out and retire and not be able to train the next generations to do this work. And there's already too few doing it. So I think this is a existential risk to being able to quickly turn the tide if we don't get real progress very quickly.
Yeah, thank you. I think so too. We do know that we have shortages when it comes to the people who work within the cancer care, but this is also a problem. I don't see any more. I don't see any more questions. I continue to ask you questions, and this time I want to ask you, Leslie. How do you think that countries are using the hub data to support their AMR strategy and set priorities? And can you please give us an example of this?
Thanks for that question. I think maybe one of the most relevant uses has been from Canada in the last years, because they've just published their intention to fund a new antibiotic access pilot. And we've been working with Joel Denis since 2021, when he was the head of the Canadian AMR task force, and he's actually now the hub's vice chair. And so they started to reach out to us, when they were thinking about their AMR strategy, and they were looking at the data in our dashboard. They were interested in the work that we're doing in our pool incentives working group, and also contacting the experts within the hub secretariat itself, just to give a bit more insight into the investment landscape in AMR&D and what is the current state of incentives. So they were just starting off their thought process on this. And I think just providing them with that information gave an accelerated trajectory in the end to get them to the stage where they could say, okay, here's our policy case, and bring this to the policy makers and say, we need to do a deeper dive into this and be able to provide a way forward for implementing this antibiotic access model within Canada. And that kind of paved the way for being able to go ahead and the Canadian Council of Academies did the report and provided an implementation mechanism for it. So this is a very concrete example. With other countries are using our data, for example, to refine their strategy for their national action plans, or help them just do some strategic development for new funding calls, things like this. I'll stop there because I know we've only got 5 minutes left.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, thank you very much for this. We actually have a question from Weezy Robinson. Please go ahead and put your question. I see that you raised your hand, Weezy.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate the kind of engagement we are in. I would like to know, because the last, I am sorry I joined a bit late because of a network problem. The last two presenters emphasize about the issue of registration. What are the key issues? What is the procedure of registering? What can I do? Because I come from northern part of Uganda. I really want to be part of this. And what should I do to join? Thanks.
Yes, perhaps Greg or Margot could respond on that.
Go ahead.
Sure.
I can follow up if you like.
Yeah, I think what we look at the Access to Medicine Foundation is whether companies have actually filed a dossier to register a product. So that is the first step that the company needs to initiate. And then it's up to the regulatory health authority to process that dossier in an expedited fashion. But we do feel it's the primary responsibility of the pharmaceutical company who has already received, say, first market approval by maybe the US FDA or the European Medicines Agency. Once they've filed the dossier, then it's up to the regulatory health authority to actually process it. But we are seeing innovative strategies where there's collaborative registration procedures in place that are encouraging registration on a wider scale rather than just one individual country itself. We see sometimes a country will use another country as a proxy. So if their regulatory health authority has approved it, then they will consider registering it sort of by default. So there are lots of ways that a country can sort of try to participate in different existing procedures in order to expedite registration. But I think importantly for governments in low and middle income countries, being clear and sending signals about the volumes that they may be interested in procuring, about the need in their particular countries, and understanding from the company's perspective, what is that market? What does it look like? That's really important as well, and sending a signal that they would be interested and willing to provide that product, whether in their national health system or in the private system. So there's a variety of different mechanisms at play. But certainly it's an issue that, as Greg pointed out, is a challenging one, and thinking about different innovative strategies, both from the originator company and sometimes from generic companies as well, who may be willing to take on a product and market it in their own jurisdictions where they already have a significant market presence is certainly a good strategy as well.
Thank you so much for this answer. I could just say that we have some questions in the chat, but we will follow them up after this session. And we are running out of time. We've got 1 minute left. So perhaps, Greg, if you just want to sum up with a positive vibe. Are you able to do that?
I will try. For anyone that knows me, I'm not actually an optimist, so I think that actually is important to recognize. I think really, I think for some of us that have been trying to work on this issue for most of their sort of career, I've never seen us closer to, I think, really, I think, succeeding on some fronts. I think, as Leslie said, you don't solve AMR, you don't, we just sort of find a better way to live with it. But I do think we're seeing really tangible signs of sort of supporting innovation and hopefully access. I think the next several years are going to be really critical. And so I think really the high level meeting and the follow up and the G7 and G20 engagements over the next several years, all of us working together to keep AMR high on the agenda, to make sure there's a recognition that we need to support innovation and access, I think will be critical. And that's why we really appreciate all of your help in collaboration as we sort of move towards the finish line. So reason to hope, but a lot of work to do.
Yeah, that's good last word, really. So thank you so much for this, Greg. And this actually brings us to the end of the session. And I would like to thank the panelists and, of course, our audience for this very insightful discussions. And, of course, also for your time. And I wish you a nice rest of the day. So thank you so much.